Thank you for coming. So some of you may already know me, some may not. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to explain the origins of this talk. I worked as a software developer for many years and was active in the Perl community, but I'm talking about 20 years ago. Since then, I moved into academia, and I just finished my dissertation on managing episodic contributors to free libre and open source software projects. And what I want to present here is the third paper that came from my dissertation. And this is not specifically about the Perl community. It is about a number of different communities trying to find the general practices that are being used for managing episodic, by which I mean infrequent or occasional contributors. But there were some members of the Perl community that participated in this research. So when I first started to prepare this talk, I was hoping that I would actually be able to go through the research. However, I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you a bit of an overview because I realize there's just too much to fit into this talk. So in a way, this is a pitch for you to read the paper, but I'm also happy to talk about it. It's just that there are a lot of practices that I cannot possibly go through in 20 minutes. So what is the source for what I'm presenting? Well, this was a Delphi study, which is a multi-round study where you pose a question to some people, you get their responses, you collate the responses from the group and send them back to all members of the group, and then get them to add on anything that may have been sparked by seeing other people's responses. And you repeat this for 3 rounds normally. So this study involved 24 community managers representing 22 different communities, and the people were responsible for all different kinds of roles in the community. So they were all community managers, but some were working predominantly with code, some were working, say, on event organization, and the people represented in total 23 different countries. So in the first round, I asked people to explain the problems that they had related to episodic volunteering. In the second round, I asked them to rank those problems as well as indicate which ones were present in their community. And then I also asked, well, what would you do to address these problems? And then in the third round, I asked them, of the solutions that have been provided, which ones have you yourself used? And is there any information about these solutions that you would like to add? So the solutions took the form of patterns, and so there was the opportunity to give extra information about the context or about some limitations or about some other related practices. And I also asked people to say how they would link these practices together in order to achieve some results. So I'm going to give you a brief summary of some of the results. I obviously can't go into it in detail because there were in total 65 different practices and 16 different problems that were identified in this study. So as I mentioned, there were 16 different problems, and they broadly fell into these 4 categories. So knowledge exchange involved any problems of either the episodic contributor or the community manager having insufficient information about the other. The next was the suitability of episodic contributors for the work, and this was concerns about whether or not people could actually meaningfully contribute work episodically, or whether you needed to have people engaged habitually. The next was that the community processes did not support episodic volunteering, so they were arranged primarily with the idea that people will start out in the periphery and gradually move towards the core or leave but basically just one path towards deeper and deeper commitment with no idea that people might just want to stay in the periphery. And this is actually quite important because in an earlier study where I looked at retention among episodic volunteers, I found out that the average person was engaged in approximately 4 communities episodically and 1 habitually. So when somebody is contributing to a community episodically, they're usually unlikely to become a habitual contributor because they're already habitual in another project. And then the next one was the marginalization of episodic contributors. So in this case, it would be that there was no path for recognition or path to increased responsibilities, because episodic doesn't necessarily mean that somebody won't keep coming back again and again to the community, only that they aren't going to put in the same hours that a more habitual contributor would. So here's an example of 2 of the problems that fell under the category of knowledge exchange, just to give an idea of the sort of problems that people expressed. So all of the problems that I've named here were the ones that at least 15 people out of the total of 24 had seen in their communities, and at least 1 person had named each of these as their most important problems. So these we could say are probably the 3 biggest problems that people saw. One was that episodic contributors are unaware of the opportunities to contribute. Another was that the community lacks the knowledge of the availability of episodic contributors. So the first one here is about the community communicating effectively to episodic volunteers about the options that are available to them. And the next one is more concerning being wary of giving people responsibility because you don't know about their availability, because episodic contributors are not communicating to what extent they are actually able to do things. And then under community processes not supporting episodic volunteering, there was the problem of identifying appropriate tasks. And this was a big one that came up time and time again, is how can you identify appropriate tasks that are actually meaningful and that aren't going to take you more effort to create these tasks than you'll get benefit from out of the people doing the work. And especially in the case where the person is not going to become eventually a habitual contributor, it's even more a bigger question, because if they are kind of lured to get somebody into the community, then people can accept that we put in some effort up front to get people into the community. But if people are not going to get in, then they see it as a waste of time. So I will just already add in here that some of the suggestions are for this problem, which I see a lot of people nodding their heads to, are things like looking for activities where people can meaningfully participate episodically. For instance, running the registration desk at this conference is something that somebody could meaningfully do episodically and doesn't need a huge ramp up in order to do. So looking at an example problem, this is how it's presented in the paper. So the title is given and then we briefly explain it. So in this case, the availability turned out to be a big problem, especially in event organization. So not knowing if people would be there in order to be at the registration desk and so on was what made this a big problem. So then the solutions. I mentioned that there were 65, which I'm obviously not going to go into completely. And they fell into these categories of community governance. And these are things that involve how you set up the community before you ever have any contributors or are really thinking about episodic contributors. Then community preparation, which is any steps the community might need to take before they try to accept episodic contributors. And then onboarding contributors, which may or may not be entirely about episodic contributors, working with them, and then retention of episodic contributors. So by retention, I don't necessarily mean becoming more habitual, but about getting people to return again and again. There actually is some benefit to that, mostly that people don't need to spend as much time actually learning your processes. So I want to give some example solutions to the problems that I presented earlier. This one actually had many more suggested solutions, but here was one from each category. So if the person lacks opportunities of how to contribute, one was to manage the delivery triangle, and that was to balance how long something is going to take, how much you're going to put out in a release, and so on. Another was identify appropriate tasks. Of course, we've already mentioned that is in itself a bit of a problem. But having, say, a bug tracker where you have a good beginner bugs labeled was a way to solve the problem of episodic contributors not knowing opportunities to contribute. Another was offer guided introductory events. So basically try to bring people up to speed through, say, a student type hackathon to get people involved. Another one that came up that I thought was interesting was encourage learners to mentor. So try to get people who are themselves learning involved in the process of helping people that are just maybe a little bit behind them in joining. And another suggestion was to announce milestones and celebrate meeting goals. So basically publicize what you're doing so that people would be inclined to join. Now, all of these practices, there's much more to them than just the titles. I'm just giving an overview here. So for the problem of lacking awareness about the availability of episodic contributors, there were 5 proposed solutions. Again, manage the delivery triangle. 2, to screen potential contributors. So not to take everybody that offers, but to actually try to make sure that they're sufficiently invested, if not in terms of time, in terms of emotional commitment. Another is to actually remind people. To give people permission to quit a task, but as long as they do it gracefully. So rather than having them just say, yes, yes, I'm getting to it, when in fact they themselves know that they won't. If they feel that they can quit, then you can better manage their participation. And of course, encouraging people to just quit if they are really not going to do anything at all. And then I also talked about this one, identifying appropriate tasks. So one of the suggested solutions, and this is a subset of solutions, was to define how you're going to measure things and what constitutes success, because this will help you in identifying if you actually even want episodic contributors. You might crowdsource identifying appropriate tasks, give people a choice between a few tasks, require documentation as part of a submission. That's actually something that might affect your habitual contributors more, but meaning that what you have should be well documented. And of course, reward participation. So this is an example of what one of the solutions looks like. So you can see here that it explains a little bit about the context. So if it's specific to certain roles, like say in-person event planning, then it would say that there. It will mention which concerns it relates to, the solution, as people explained in the Delphi study, any practices that are related to it, which could be related as a general specific relationship, a preceding relationship, a complementary relationship, or an alternate relationship. And then the specific challenges with implementing this, and then a list of the community managers who actually are using this, so you can look back if you want at what community they belong to, how big the community is, whether or not it might be applicable to you or not. And finally, there were workflows, which were a possible approach to addressing a concern by stringing together a number of practices. And these are much more specific to certain communities. They are not general practices because each community manager had their own impression of how they could best string together practices to address a problem. So this is an example workflow for the problem of lacking awareness of opportunities to contribute. And it's a very sequential workflow. I mean, you start by identifying appropriate tasks, you listen to suggestions, you list the current areas of activity, and so on. Here's a completely alternate workflow that's addressing the same problem. This person wanted to start with crafting a community vision and sending ambassadors to small events, and then simultaneously having a key contributor responsible and encouraging social connections. So as I said, this has just been a really quick overview. Unfortunately, this was not a paper that converted as well to a talk as I would have liked. So let me point out that the actual paper itself has not yet been published, although it has been accepted. However, it is present in my dissertation, which you can find at the URL there by searching for my name, and that's the title of the study. So, thank you. Any questions? All right. Thanks.
Well, actually, do you know when it will be available? Should repeat the question as well.
So Nick asked when the paper will be available. Well, I'm happy to report that on the 19th of February, I received a notification that the paper was accepted pending minor corrections, and I have until the 19th of this month to finish them. It's what I've been working on today. Usually, academic is so much slower than anything else. But usually, it will take the associate editor about 1 month or so to totally approve it, and then it will be published. But pretty much, all the practices are in my dissertation. The only thing that has really changed is the presentation of the research has changed from the version in my dissertation to the present version.
Could you please elaborate on some details on the effect if when I in my open source project prepackage like ready-made tasks for beginners, what if I do it, what is the effect of that?
So the question is, what is the effect of prepackaging tasks? And I can't tell you about the effectiveness of that to your project. One, it's not something I've studied. And two, it seems to be very variable depending on the project. But in terms of engaging episodic contributors and also newcomers, which is related research, it does tend to help reduce barriers to entry for newcomers. So the question is whether there's a big difference between knowledge communities and code communities. This study focused primarily on code communities, although looking at all the different tasks associated with it, like translation and so on. So I haven't specifically studied, say, Wikipedia or Stack Overflow. However, there were 2 communities included here that were more engaged in building practices or in building participation. One is the Chaos Project, which is doing community metrics to measure community health. And the other was Women Who Code, which is about getting women involved in software development. So it wasn't entirely open source projects. And there were no differences that were noted between these 2 projects and the other projects. However, there were some differences that related to the task that people are engaged in. And that's noted in the context of the problem or the solution.
Can you elaborate a bit on what the release triangle thing is? I didn't really understand that.
So the release triangle is about basically you can do something on time or on budget, or yeah, it's that idea that basically you can diminish the number of features, or you can change your release date, because you can't change people. So it's in more detail, of course, in the paper itself. All right, thank you. It was really nice to be back at a Perl event.